Okay, so we are going to start this Ask Me Anything session with Michel Weststrate.
Wow, Weststrate, yes.
Nice, nice. And he was speaking this morning about the different approaches to state management. I think that was a very interesting talk. And it reminded me that sometimes some people just disregard other approaches. They pick maybe one of the libraries, and then they go mental, and it's like the source of truth. And then when you show them that there's actually other ways of doing exactly the same thing, they are kind of like, oh my God, I didn't realize. So, yeah, we have a few questions that we were recording during this morning, and we can take some of those. We can also take your questions, and yeah, we'll spend some time covering those. So the first question is, what about Apollo link state for local state handling? What's your take?
I think it's not what I've seen from it so far. It feels to me it's not entirely there yet. It's like currently quite complicated still for simple things to do it with Apollo link state. But the idea makes a lot of sense. In that sense that you have like one unified way of working with data, regardless whether it's from the backend or just some local state. I just think it needs to evolve more. For example, if I'm not mistaken, they don't have a concept for like really derived, smartly updating information yet.
Okay.
So it's either what you define your data model and nothing beyond that. But I think it will just get more serious in the coming time and makes more and more sense if you're on Apollo anyway already. Yeah,
but in the context of if you have a solution that is already using Apollo, then it makes a lot of sense in that we are a good fit for that application.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that most of the improvements have to be still made on like the API level, where it becomes as easy to use as local component state, for example. Mm-hmm. And if they manage to bridge that gap, then it makes a lot of sense to have one unified way.
Awesome. Any questions from the people here? Yeah, you want to throw one?
What's the threshold that one would consider a state management framework, for example?
For me, the thing where a state management framework becomes really relevant is as soon as you want to separate your UI from your state. And there can be a few reasons to do that. One is, for example, you use the same state or the same logic across multiple pieces of your stack. For example, in the front end or back end, or also with Angular or something. Another reason can be that like your state is hard to normalize, where sometimes you have the state which doesn't really match your view tree nicely. Like your view is a tree, but it turns out that you keep pulling all your state up because it's needed at a lot of different places. And then it also makes for me a lot of sense of just pulling the state outside, having that defined separately, testing it separately, and then making your view dumber by pulling the rest out of a state management library. So just the main driver is, I think, the complexity of the application. And like if you're already really familiar with a certain solution, then you will introduce it earlier, just because you're used to it. But the primary driver should be complexity.
It seems we got we got a really fun pop-up. Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, so we can go for the next question. And okay, it's very insistent. Okay, that's good. So the next question, I think you can also see it on the screen there. So does it still make sense if you want to stick with either Redux or Molex in the context of a GraphQL application? Or you will always use like Apollo link state instead?
I think sometimes. I think usually not. The cases where it might make sense is like where you have some state that isn't delivered through Apollo. For example, because your for some state might be really local or really temporal, like complex form state or something. But I think in most cases, might be overkill to use both.
Yep, makes sense. I think we have a question here.
Yeah, that's true. So like, if you use React in its purest form, like the cleanest mental model possible, what you would be doing is like just rendering your whole component tree entirely for everything that changes. That's like the conceptual model that gets presented to you by React. Like you don't want to think about what updates when. In practice, the problem is that it doesn't scale enough, because it's even with Virtual DOM, it's too expensive to reconcile your entire component tree the whole time. So that means that in practice, whatever solution you pick, be it Apollo or Redux or Molex, there's always somewhere a subscription mechanism that just makes sure that some components get updated based on state. And so that's indeed the point where you break with the conceptual super simple model. But the model what you need in practice to build a big performant application.
So I'm going to repeat just for the recording. So the question is that we lose some of the features that we had before with Redux, and one of them is the automatic re-rendering of the components when we get a change, and which I understood that Molex it needs some extra code, so we lose some of that.
No, I think the question was more the inverse, that like with Molex you lose some control over when that's happening, because it's done for you. So in essence, the model is from Redux to Molex. It's not very different in a certain way. So in both cases, you have components that start to subscribing to a part of the state. So in Redux, you typically have the separation between the container components and the presentational components, or the smart and the dumb components. But it's also a case like a container component renders independently of its own parent. So there you have the same thing. And in the official old React documentation, they called it sideways loading. So the idea that something else influences a rendering deep in the tree. And that concept, you still have a Molex, except that with Molex, more components are smart, because Observer basically makes them smart themselves. So almost every component that deals with observables is basically a container component. So that might kind of set you off, because it's like not super explicit which ones are the container components, because basically all the observer components are the container components, if you would translate the mechanisms. If you have less control in practice, I'm not sure. I hear people in general also be pretty happy, especially since we introduced trace. So you could put a trace call inside a Molex component, and then it would break and exactly show in the stack trace which mutation was causing the change. Which is really nice because it's actually synchronous, so you can really trace it back to the action that's causing the update. But yeah, those details are hidden away from you. So in that sense, it's a price you always pay for abstraction. The more abstraction you get, the more of a closed box you have.
Cool. We have a couple more questions, but we can take another one from the audience.
Not big ones. So I think.
So the question is, what are the new features in the latest versions of Molex? Or in the coming versions of Molex? So what's coming?
So there are a few interesting things that are coming. The most significant one is probably the decorator stage 3 implementation. So decorators are almost one stage further in standardization. Which means that the behavior changed a bit. But there's PR already for that, just waiting until the standard continues. And the other one is adopting hooks once they are stabilized. Actually, I did already an initial rewrite of the bindings with hooks, and that solved a lot of known edge cases and weird workarounds. So I'm really happy about it. But beyond that, there are not like really big changes planned within the library itself. Are you maybe missing something specific?
And it's going to be in the version 5, or it's going to be something?
It will most probably in version 4 and 5.
Awesome. I want to remind all the people here that you can use the Slido app. You just need to join this hash ReactiveConf 18, and you can add your questions there if you find it easier. So the next question we have, it's we covered this one. So the next one, I guess it's asking if it's what's better, using Molex or immutable JS? I mean, if that's something you can do. I'm not sure you can.
You can't really compare them because one is a state management library and the other one is a data structure library. It might be that the question was about immer.
Okay.
I can imagine that was about immer versus immutable.
I think you got the question wrong. Since it was about the dog, I guess the author is asking, is it better to use Remy or immutable JS?
Okay.
That calls me. Definitely use immutable JS. I mean, Remy is just an experiment.
So the actual code that
it does kind of work,
you showed this
like
morning.
not really tested thoroughly or something.
I mean, why not?
Time.
Well, that's another question, really quickly solved. Any other questions that you may think? Yeah, we got one there.
I have one question. It's not about for once. Michel, in Paris, there's a really cool talk about this typing, static versus dynamic. I really liked it. The other day, I had time to play with it, and actually, it's very cool. So, but I hate a lot of this wrong books like error recovery is really awful. Never know like what's actually broken and so on. So what is your recommendation, or maybe for something like more complete solution for this dynamic typing?
There are two solutions I know of. At React Europe, I talked about writing your own type system that runs at runtime. So very similar to prop types, where you can like define the shape of an object and you can then verify your responses from a server or something that the shape is correct for context. And then the fun part is that the runtime library you write, you can actually apply type inference to it with, for example, TypeScript. And then you can also statically check whether your data you're passing into a function matches your runtime type you declared in your own type system. It's quite mind-blowing that it works. It's really interesting. And there are, as far as I know, 2 libraries that do it. One is tcomp by GDO Conti. He made, it's called tcomp, tcombinator, type combinators. He made a standalone library out of it. And I think it also has decent error reporting, like where it fails. And the other one is it's used in Molex state tree. So in Molex state tree, you define models of your data. And then also any change you apply will be validated against the types you defined. And then you get also detailed error messages. So if you're just looking for the runtime type system, what works like at a talk, I would definitely go for the tcomp library.
Cool. Well, we have another question, I guess, from the audience. So do you think the React Context App API has removed the need for additional state management libraries in React applications?
The answer to the question is really simply no.
Okay.
Let me explain. React Context API didn't change anything in regards to what was possible in React with context. Everything you can do with the new Context API, we could already do it before. It was just the API was not as officially, and you needed packages for it, like React Broadcast or something. But the basic problem is it's like quite coarse-grained. So I always see context more as a dependency injection mechanism, where you can like inject your theme or your language or those kind of things. But not really as state management. Imagine, for example, if you have a to-do list with 100 items, what are you going to put in your context? Do you create one context that contains all those 100 to-do items? And then you basically need a state management library to update that data in the context smartly. Or are you going to create 100 contexts, one for each to-do item? I think that also would result in really horrible code. So the short answer is no, it doesn't change the game, I think, in terms of state management. The thing that it does solve is, for example, the mob React bindings, they had always provider inject. The same is true for the Redux bindings. And those we could, I think, basically get at least partially rid of, because you can do the same thing with context in a very clean way.
Okay, awesome. So I guess there's few questions that I think we covered. Let's see if we can get some more. So I guess that's covered already. Let's cover this last one, the second one now. What are your tips to managing an open source as popular as Molex? I mean, after having been, you know, the main maintainer behind a large open source project, what would be your advice? Like, what to do, what not to do, something like this.
First of all, I'm still trying to figure it out. But there are a few things I noticed that worked really well. And one is to have a really clear philosophy of your project and a really clear scope boundary, because otherwise your project will basically be taken over by everybody who needs a very specific feature. But once you have that boundary set, you can also really be relaxed and allowing others to contribute. That can be answering questions. Sometimes somebody asks for a feature. I just ask them, I can imagine you don't know how to build a feature, but then at least make a pull request to add some unit tests that verify the feature as you like it. And in those kind of things, I really try to encourage people to join. I'm also like not really strict about code style and those kind of things. I think I'm in open source less strict in that way as in my professional projects, because, well, I'm not paying the person to do it. If it works out fine, and it works out fine, and otherwise, we can manage projects easily because it's open source and we can revert things easily. So just test coverage is extremely important because then you have the confidence that you can have others mess around with the code and they'll find out themselves that they did something wrong. Another very important thing is to become a bit strict about issues that are filed. So, like, if there's not a clear reproduction or a clear explanation, a runnable reproduction, then usually I don't really investigate features, because then I'm just basically doing the work somebody else is already being paid to do. And that is very time-consuming if you have to like clone a Ruby repository and start a project and install 7 tools just to isolate the bug. So usually when people file issues, my question is file something isolated, a small reproduction. And sometimes people will say, I don't manage to, or I don't have the time to isolate it, or etc. And then I'm simply, well, if you don't have time to reproduce the problem you are being paid to solve, then I, of course, have no time to fix a problem I'm not even paid to solve. So that helps you to keep sane. And also, and I think that holds for programming in general, you also have to learn to be detached from your product. I mean, it's your product, it's not you. Some will like it, some won't. Some will fight with it. Some days your project will cause somebody else to have a few bad days because they're like stuck and they can't figure it out. That happens and you can really help it. And that's, you have to be able to detach from that and realize that basically you're sharing your work for free, but then doesn't mean that there's an obligation back to make sure that people get unstuck. So I know that is quite an important thing to realize, otherwise you will never be able to take a holiday, basically. And finally, what really helped with my big sets is finding those early adopters, talk with them, and especially encourage them to share their excitement. Because basically you can't sell your own stuff, because, well, it's you selling your own stuff. It's not like super believable. So it's really cool if you can find a few people that are enthusiastic and are willing to share their experiences. Even if there are downsides, they're sharing, it's still fine, kinda, because at least they're talking about it. And so that also really helps.
Yeah, I think we can use this moment, to thank you for sharing, a library like Molex. So I would thank you for that. It's hard
Thanks.
work, for a long time now for you, and really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, so we have probably time for another question, and then we will wrap up. So this one is, what tooling do you recommend to actually debug an application that is using Molex? You have any tips or any tricks that you use?
There are the Molex DevTools for Chrome, and quite some people use them, I think. I don't really use them myself, I have to admit. Still, my favorite tool of debugging is just the debugger. And I noticed there's actually a surprising amount of people that mostly use console statements and such for debugging. I come from a Java background, so I always use like debugging with a debugger and hot reload swapping, code swapping, and those kind of things. And when I joined the front-end world and did all JavaScript, and then I saw people doing all this console log stuff again, I got really confused. So I think debugger, like just debugger statements, are a great way to debug an application. And actually, because you can do really powerful things with them. So for example, you can use conditional debug statements to more precisely know when it will hit your breakpoint. You can even put console.log statements in your condition of your debugger statement. So then you get console logging for free. And also, sometimes you just want to check whether something very specific in an object is updated. And you could use spy or observe from Molex, but there's also a more general approach which works for everything. And that is just wrap a property of an object in a getter setter and put a debugger in there. And then you can just intercept the reads and writes from the engine to your property. That is if you really need to go deep. But the best way of debugging is still just to take a step back, take a walk, think about what you might be seeing.
Think a little bit about what you're trying to do and what the behavior that you are seeing. Well, that was a really interesting chat. Of course, Michel is going to be around for the next couple of days. So if you want to reach him, I think he's a really nice guy. So do approach him and ask him any other questions that you may that may pop up in your mind. Thanks a lot for coming to this Ask Me Anything session. And yeah, I hope to see you around. Thanks.
Thanks.